Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Mm.
So, imagine a devout Presbyterian pastor, a Muslim, a Hindu, and a group of atheistic Satanists, all just, walking into the same room to sit down face to face.
Sounds like the setup to a joke, honestly.
Right. It
Yeah.
totally does. But what actually happens when these people hash out their core beliefs? Well, it completely rewrites how we understand the origins of good and evil. Today, we're exploring this massive collision of worldviews.
Yeah, focusing heavily on God, atheism, and modern Satanism.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the mechanics of divine sacrifice, the total absence of belief, whether the serpent in the Garden of Eden was actually humanity's first freedom fighter, and how two radically different paths might just be searching for the exact same definition of good.
It's just a remarkable conversation to analyze because it forces us to strip away all those cultural caricatures we usually rely on.
Oh, for sure. We aren't just looking at people arguing over who is right and who is wrong.
No, we're watching them try to construct the fundamental architecture of morality from just completely opposing starting lines.
Yeah, and to guide us through this architectural dispute today, we are pulling from two very different sources. The primary one is this detailed transcript from a Jubilee Middle Ground dialogue, where these believers and Satanists actually sit down and debate their worldviews.
Which is fascinating on its own, but then there's the second source.
Yeah, but our second source is, well, it's weird.
Extremely weird.
It's this bizarre audio snippet from a YouTube channel called Detective Data, and it literally just consists of a voice repeating the word heat over and over again. Just heat, heat, heat.
I mean, as absurd as that audio sounds on its surface, it actually serves as a pretty brilliant thematic anchor for what we're talking about today.
How so?
Well, it's the literal soundscape of ideological friction. Like
Yeah.
when you put a devout theist and an atheistic Satanist in a room, you generate heat.
Oh, right. And then you have the literal theological heat of hellfire, which is, super central to this whole debate.
Exactly. And the Jubilee transcript gives us the actual substance of that friction, showing us the underlying mechanics of why these deep divides even exist.
Yeah, and that friction is exactly what we are going to dive into. But really quickly, before we get too deep into the flames, I want to say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
It really helps out.
It does.
Yeah.
Because whether you are listening to this deep dive as a fiercely devout believer, a staunch atheist, or, you're just insanely curious about the psychological machinery of human belief, this is going to challenge how you define authority and purpose in your own life.
It really is. And to understand this divide, we have to look at the ultimate stakes first.
The end game.
Right. For the theists in the room, particularly from the Christian perspective, morality is just inextricably tied to a cosmic endgame.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Sean, the Presbyterian pastor in our source, he lays this out very clearly. For him, hell isn't just like some medieval scare tactic.
No, he sees it as an architectural necessity for justice.
Exactly. His argument is that if humans commit these unspeakable atrocities against one another, and they somehow evade justice in this earthly life, the universe demands an ultimate reckoning.
A balancing of the scale.
Right. But the counterbalance to that terrifying justice is God's grace, which he frames as this incredibly generous gift paid at an incomprehensible price.
Jesus taking the infinite penalty for humanity's sins.
Yeah. And that is the foundational mechanism, right?
Yeah, substitutionary atonement in Christian theology. The belief that the moral debt of humanity is just so massive that only a divine infinite being could possibly absorb it.
But the transcript reveals this profound skepticism from the Satanists regarding the actual math of that sacrifice.
Oh, yeah. Richard Lace's comment?
Yeah. Richard Lace, one of the Satanists, famously pushes back and flat out calls the crucifixion giving up a weekend.
Which is just...
I mean, I have to admit, that phrasing stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
But you look at it strictly from a secular materialist perspective, I see the logic they're deploying.
Sure.
If a billionaire gives up a few $1,000s, is it really a sacrifice?
Right, because it doesn't impact their survival.
Exactly. That's exactly the logic the Satanists are applying to a divine, immortal being dying for 3 days. If Jesus was God before the crucifixion, God during it, and God after it, returning to eternal glory.
Where is the permanent loss?
Right. Where is the loss? To the Satanists, the math of a 3-day temporary death just doesn't add up to a demand for eternal, unquestioning devotion.
You're hitting on the core friction point there.
Okay.
The Satanists are evaluating divine actions using strictly human material metrics.
Yeah.
And Lois, she's a Satanist who actually transitioned out of Judaism. She takes that material evaluation a step further into the realm of ethics.
What does she argue?
She basically questions the morality of the system itself. Like, she essentially asks how a deity can be considered objectively good or worthy of worship if that deity system punishes the simple, passive act of non-belief with an eternal lake of fire.
Wow. So to her, that isn't justice at all.
No, to her, that's infinite torture for a finite, victimless crime.
Which brings us right back to that repeating heat audio. The Satanists look at the heat of hell not as a necessary mechanism for cosmic justice, but as, like, a tool of coercion.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that the heat of the afterlife isn't even a uniform concept among the religious participants themselves.
Right, because Anwar is there too.
Yeah, Amr, the Muslim participant, he describes the afterlife not as this cartoonish inferno, but as a good place and a bad place, determined strictly by a very literal accounting of your earthly actions.
And then you have Rajini, the Hindu participant, who shifts the focus almost entirely away from a final cosmic courtroom by bringing in the concept of dharma.
Which is so different from the Abrahamic view.
I actually need some clarity here, because we often hear the word dharma thrown around in, like, Western wellness circles as just living your truth or finding your purpose.
Yeah, it gets watered down a lot.
But how does it actually function as a moral mechanism compared to the Christian or Islamic idea of a final judgment?
Well, it's a completely different operating system. In the Abrahamic traditions, morality is largely based on divine command theory. God makes the rules, and you are judged at the end of your life based on your compliance.
Right, a top-down system.
Exactly. But Dharma, in Hinduism, operates more like the laws of physics. It's the intrinsic underlying order of the universe.
Okay.
So when you act in accordance with Dharma, you're swimming with the current of reality. When you act against it, you generate spiritual friction.
Karma.
Right, karma, which affects your present and future state of being. So there isn't a judge handing down a sentence. There is just the natural, inescapable consequence of your own actions echoing through time.
That is a massive shift in perspective. But then you have Jason.
Oh, Jason.
Yeah, the Satanist who used to be Pentecostal, who looks at all of this, the Christian heaven, the Islamic accounting, the Hindu dharma, and he just demands empirical proof.
He takes skepticism to the absolute extreme.
He really does. He jokes that he barely believes human beings are fully conscious, let alone that we possess immortal souls floating off to another dimension.
And Jason's absolute materialism introduces a really critical architectural question for this whole deep dive. If there is no eternal judge, no afterlife, and no cosmic scoreboard.
Who owns the definition of good?
Exactly. If the sky is empty, where does the rule book come from?
And that naturally pivots the conversation to the concept of a higher purpose. Sean, the pastor, talks about the immense psychological and societal utility of having a higher purpose.
Especially during chaotic times.
Yes, exactly. He points to global crises like a pandemic. In his view, a higher purpose helps society process random, chaotic pain.
It gives it meaning.
Right. It binds a culture together by saying, hey, this suffering isn't meaningless. There's a grander narrative at play.
It provides a top-down narrative framework that stabilizes human anxiety. But the atheistic Satanists, they vehemently reject this.
Yeah, they really push back on that.
They view a prescriptive higher purpose, like the idea that you were engineered by a deity for a specific, predetermined path. They view that as a cage.
Because it strips away human agency.
Exactly. So instead of looking up for purpose, Jason and Lois argue for a philosophy of radical self-reliance.
See, I struggle with this concept a bit. Let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Isn't radical self-reliance just a philosophical rebrand for pure, unadulterated selfishness? Like, if everyone in a society is radically self-reliant, aren't we just a couple of power grid failures away from total collapse?
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Right. Society requires people to sacrifice for the collective. Can society function like a synchronized swimming routine without a choreographer? The religious folks say, no, you need that higher purpose to bind culture. But the Satanists argue the swimmers just need to focus on taking care of themselves so they don't drown each other.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, taking personal responsibility actually replaces divine mandate for atheists. Jason explains the mechanics of how this works in practice, relying on what philosophers call enlightened self-interest.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
He argues that taking care of your community can actually be viewed as a selfish act, and he doesn't mean that as a negative.
Wait, how is helping someone else selfish?
Well, if you volunteer to clean up your neighborhood park, or you help your neighbor during a storm, You are directly improving the environment that you yourself have to live in.
Oh, I see. So you don't need a divine mandate to want your street to be safe. You want it to be safe because you live there.
Exactly. Think of the difference between proprietary software and open source software.
Okay.
The religious framework is like proprietary software. There's a master developer, God, who writes the code, sets the terms of service, and you follow the user manual to keep the system from crashing.
That makes sense.
But the Satanist framework is open source. There is no master developer. We are all just users sharing the network. We quickly realize that if we introduce malware into the system, or if we let the servers overheat, we all suffer.
So cooperation is just practical.
Yes, taking personal responsibility and cooperating with the users next to you wholly replaces the need for a top-down developer. The incentive to build a moral framework is simply our shared biological reality.
That's a great way to frame it. But if we want to trace exactly where these two groups diverge on the nature of authority, here's where it gets really interesting.
The origin story.
Yes, we have to look at how they interpret the ultimate origin story of right and wrong, the Garden of Eden.
Oh, absolutely. It's the foundational blueprint of Western morality, and how you read that blueprint literally determines your entire worldview.
So for the Christians in the room, the Garden of Eden is viewed as a perfect environment. It was designed by God for humans to flourish in a loving, unashamed relationship with their Creator.
Right.
And in that framework, Satan is the ultimate intruder. He is the deceiver who introduces sin, creates a rupture between humanity and God, and basically ruins paradise.
But the atheistic Satanists look at that exact same text and perform a complete inversion of the hero-villain dynamic.
It's wild.
They don't see Eden as a loving paradise at all. They see it as a terrarium.
A terrarium.
Yeah, a gilded cage where humans were kept docile. When they look at the serpent, they don't see a deceiver. They see a symbol of enlightenment and liberty.
So to them, the serpent was literally the very first advocate for equal rights.
Exactly. Offering humanity the fruit of knowledge so they could open their eyes and think for themselves.
Lois actually says that God wanted to keep humans naked and stupid as playthings, and that rebelling against that tyranny was a fundamentally justifiable moral action.
It completely flips the script.
It really does. Authority is no longer inherently good just because it is powerful.
And this isn't exclusively a Western rebellion against Christian tropes either. Regini adds a really fascinating layer to this by explaining the Hindu perspective.
What does she say?
In her tradition, the entity that causes disruption, like the Satan figure, if you will, isn't an embodiment of pure cosmic evil. Instead, that entity acts almost like an assistant to the divine.
Wait, really? An assistant?
Yeah. The disruption they cause is a necessary friction. It's a catalyst designed to force human beings to evolve, learn, and ultimately progress toward enlightenment.
That brings up a massive question for you, the listener. If the origin of evil is up for debate, and the serpent might actually be the good guy, is morality just entirely subjective?
It's a tough question.
There is this very mundane yet perfect anecdote in the transcript that captures this tension. They start discussing a guy hoarding toilet paper during the pandemic lockdown.
Ah, yes, the ultimate modern stress test for ethical theories.
Right. So think back to what you did during the first week of that lockdown. Did you buy an extra pack? Maybe 2? Now look at the guy who bought 10 packs while the shelves went empty. Is that man evil?
Well, Regini points out that the act itself causes harm because it deprives the community.
True. But let's look at the internal mechanism of the hoarder. To that man, he probably believes he's executing peak radical self-reliance. He's protecting his family from an unknown threat.
Right. In his own mind, he isn't the villain. He is the hero of his own survival story, which forces both sides in the Jubilee dialogue to define what goodness actually looks like in practice.
Yeah.
Because when you strip away the theology of Eden, the cosmic scoreboard, and the concept of an afterlife, both the believers and the Satanists come to a surprising consensus.
What's that?
That goodness is not a stagnant trait. It's an active, ongoing process built on micro-actions.
Minute daily choices.
Yes.
Yeah.
Richard Lyle points out that while your internal intention matters, like wanting to protect your family, it's your external action that materializes your morality.
So you can't just slap a label on yourself.
Exactly. You cannot simply adopt a label, call yourself a good Christian or a good Satanist, and assume your work is done. You have to constantly weigh your personal intentions against the actual measurable impact your actions have on the people standing next to you in the grocery store aisle.
But if goodness is defined by our daily individual microactions, How do we evaluate the massive historical macro actions of organized religion? We're talking about institutions that have shaped human history for millennia.
That is the elephant in the room. And remarkably, the religious participants do not shy away from it. There's actually a significant amount of concession.
Yeah, they readily agree that religion has caused immense documented harm. They explicitly discuss the Crusades, the witch trials, and the historical subjugation of scientific inquiry.
It's a heavy legacy.
Very heavy. And Richard Lale makes a sharp analytical observation here. He strips away the divine aura of religion and labels it simply as a form of power. It's a tool.
And like any massively powerful tool, it acts as an amplifier.
Exactly. It reveals the absolute worst, most tyrannical instincts in humanity, but it also reveals our greatest capacities.
And speaking of those greatest capacities, this leads to what is arguably the most surprising twist in the entire transcript.
Oh, the art discussion.
Yes, the atheistic Satanists, the exact same people who just argued that the God of the Bible is a tyrant who kept humans in a terrarium, they express a profound, genuine love for religious art.
It's so unexpected. Lois talks about her love for classic portraits of St. Sebastian. They praise the sweeping architecture of grand cathedrals and the emotional weight of choral music.
It seems like a massive contradiction at first glance.
It really does, but it perfectly illustrates the mechanics of their worldview. They are entirely capable of divorcing the aesthetic, cultural beauty of human creation from the dogmatic theology that funded it.
Right. When a Satanist stands in a cathedral, they aren't admiring the deity the building was dedicated to. They're admiring the human ingenuity, the engineering, and the deep emotional resonance of the human beings who stacked those stones. They appreciate the art as a testament to humanity, not divinity.
I find it fascinating how much these supposedly opposite belief systems actually share when it comes to, like, boots on the ground human interaction.
Oh, completely.
Amar points out that Islam has specific chapters in the Quran dedicated to the concept of respecting others, essentially laying out the framework of your religion is yours and mine is mine.
And on the other side of the room, Lois points out that the very first foundational tenet of the Satanic Temple is a mandate to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures.
So they're basically using completely different dictionaries to arrive at the exact same ethical baseline. Treat people well.
But this raises an important question. We have to ask if that baseline of respect is actually functionally identical. Richard Lale dropped a bit of a bombshell on the whole coexist narrative.
Oh, right. This part was tense.
He argues that when major exclusivist religions say, I respect your religion, it is often just a polite social platitude.
Just keeping the peace.
Right. He suggests that underneath that thin veneer of politeness is a rigid, structural belief that their specific way is the only true way, and that everyone else in the room is fundamentally, eternally wrong.
So is the phrase, I respect your religion, a genuine statement of harmony? Or is it just code for, I'm being polite while I wait for you to go to hell?
That is exactly the friction Richard Lale is highlighting. And this brings us to the actual purpose of modern Satanism.
Which a lot of people misunderstand.
Completely. When you look at groups like the Satanic Temple or the Church of Satan, you realize these are not people sacrificing animals in the woods.
No, not at all.
They're relatively new, highly progressive ideological movements. They utilize the provocative, culturally loaded imagery of Satan not to worship a literal pitchfork-wielding entity, but as a literary device.
They're essentially using the devil as a mascot for the ultimate contrarian.
Precisely. They use that imagery to advocate for the strict separation of church and state, for bodily autonomy, and for scientific skepticism.
They're holding up a mirror.
Yes. They hold up this dark, theatrical mirror to society. The goal is to force religious majorities to justify their moral frameworks with reason, evidence, and empathy, rather than just pointing to an ancient text and demanding compliance.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with the mechanics of a divine being giving up a weekend, moves to the ethics of hoarding toilet paper, and ended up with atheistic Satanists admiring the acoustics of Christian cathedrals.
It's been a wild ride.
It really has. But the ultimate takeaway that surfaces from all of these sources through all the heat and friction we talked about is that this divide isn't actually about who is inherently good and who is inherently evil.
Not at all.
No, it's an architectural dispute about where morality comes from, whether it's top-down compliance or bottom-up consensus. Everyone in that room is striving for the exact same earthly goal, to be a good person through intentional daily microactions.
Which leaves us with a fascinating paradox to consider.
What's that?
Well, if modern Satanism functions primarily as a mirror to challenge religious authority and advocate for humanism, what happens if, say, centuries from now, major religions become entirely secularized?
Oh, wow.
Right. Imagine a future society based purely on human empathy, open source morality, and cool art. Would a society based purely on that still be able to fulfill our deep evolutionary psychological craving for ritual?
That's a huge question.
Or is the literal fear of divine judgment secretly the load-bearing foundation that keeps human civilization from collapsing in on itself?
That is definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Keep questioning the architecture of your own beliefs. Keep examining the impact of your daily microactions, and we will catch you next time.